Today, Newcastle looks like a city that has moved on from steel, a harbour city, a coastal city. But for most of the 20th century, this was Australia's steel city. Here, the furnaces shaped the skyline, and steel shaped the city. For generations, an enormous workforce built their lives around the furnaces. People entered these gates to build careers, raise families, and become part of a city whose identity was tied to the industry. For decades, the furnaces burned, ships came and went, and Newcastle seemed almost inseparable from steel. Then the world changed. In 1999, Newcastle's steelmaking ended. The furnaces went silent, but Newcastle did not. So what happens to a city when the industry that built it disappears? And what remains when the furnaces are gone? This is Beneath Australia, and beneath the modern city of Newcastle lies the story of the Steel City. To understand how it began, we have to go back to the beginning. Long before Newcastle became an industrial city, this was Awabakal country with Aboriginal connections to the land extending back thousands of years. European settlement came much later. Newcastle was established as a penal settlement in the early 19th century, and one of the resources that quickly gave the settlement its importance lay beneath the ground: coal. It was close to the harbour. Coal could be mined here, moved to the water, loaded onto ships, and sent beyond Newcastle. What began as a remote settlement was gradually becoming an industrial port. But coal alone was not enough. Newcastle needed a way to move it. Roads became railways. Mines were connected to the harbour, and the harbour itself was transformed to handle a growing coal trade. By the second half of the 19th century, Newcastle was no longer simply a place where coal was extracted. It was becoming a city built around the movement of coal. Mines spread across the surrounding landscape. Railways connected mining communities to the port. Ships carried Newcastle's coal overseas, and businesses, workers, and families followed. Newcastle already had the foundations of an industrial city, but the greatest transformation was still ahead. Coal had given Newcastle its first industrial advantage. The harbour had given it a gateway to the world, and the railways had connected the two. All that was missing was the industry that would turn Newcastle into something much larger: steel. By the beginning of the 20th century, Newcastle already had many of the things a major industrial city needed: coal, railways, a working harbour, and generations of people whose lives were already connected to industry. But Newcastle still wasn't the steel city. That transformation began with the Broken Hill Proprietary Company. BHP had started as a mining company at Broken Hill, but its ambitions were growing beyond mining. Australia was producing enormous quantities of raw materials. The opportunity was to turn those resources into something the country increasingly needed: steel. Making steel on that scale required more than iron ore. It required coal, transport, water, a port, and enough space for an enormous industrial complex. Newcastle already had much of what was needed. Coal was available from the surrounding region. The harbour connected the city to the sea. Railways connected Newcastle to a growing national economy, and beside the harbour was the space to build something enormous. Newcastle had spent more than a century becoming a coal city. Now, those same advantages made it an ideal place to become something else. In 1912, BHP chose Newcastle as the site of its new steelworks. Construction began the following year, and on the edge of the harbour, an industrial landscape began to rise. Furnaces, workshops, rail lines, wharves, machinery. In April 1915, the works produced its first steel rail. In June, the Newcastle Steelworks officially opened. The timing was significant. Europe was at war. Australia had traditionally relied heavily on imported manufactured goods, including steel. Now, domestic steelmaking had strategic importance. Newcastle's new steelworks had arrived at a moment when Australia needed more of what it could produce at home. Orders came from Australian industry and railways. Production expanded. More workers were needed. And around the steelworks, Newcastle began changing again. The city that had spent the 19th century sending coal out into the world was now using its industrial advantages to manufacture something at home. Instead of simply extracting a resource, Newcastle was adding another layer to its economy. But steel required scale. Raw materials had to keep arriving. Finished steel had to keep moving. Workers were needed around the clock. The steelworks became a vast system connecting mines, ships, railways, workshops, and people, and Newcastle was becoming something it had never been before: the steel city. But factories do not create cities by machinery alone. Newcastle's transformation depended on the people who entered those gates every day. As the steelworks expanded, so did the workforce. The work was demanding. The machinery was enormous. The heat, noise, and danger were part of everyday life. But for many workers, BHP offered something increasingly valuable in an industrial Australia: a job that could last. Some workers stayed for decades. Across the history of the steelworks, thousands of people passed through its gates. For some families, the connection lasted across generations. A father could begin his working life at the steelworks, his son could follow him, and years later, another generation could do the same. The steelworks was becoming more than a workplace. It was becoming part of family history, but the workforce was also changing the city itself. Newcastle's industrial growth drew people from far beyond the Hunter. Migrants arrived looking for work and a new beginning. In Mayfield, communities grew around the steelworks, bringing together workers and families from different backgrounds. They did not simply arrive to work in a factory. They built homes, raised families, and became part of the city they had come to work in. For some migrants, the steelworks became the place where an entirely new Australian life began. One example was Frank Kadlec, who arrived at Newcastle's steelworks from Czechoslovakia in 1969. He initially spoke little English. Over the following decades, he built a long career inside the works. His story was one example of a much larger pattern. The steelworks became a place where people from different backgrounds built working lives together. And over time, that created something difficult to measure: loyalty. BHP's presence reached far beyond the factory floor. It shaped neighbourhoods, friendships, routines. And for generations of Newcastle families, the steelworks became part of the rhythm of everyday life. When thousands of people depend on the same industry, its fortunes become inseparable from the fortunes of the place around it. When the industry grows, the city grows with it. And when that industry begins to disappear, the consequences reach far beyond the factory gates. By the middle of the 20th century, Newcastle's steelworks had become far more than a local industry. The city was now producing something Australia's expanding industrial economy increasingly depended upon: steel. It went into railways, bridges, buildings, machinery, ships, and the infrastructure of a rapidly industrialising country. Newcastle had begun as a place where Australia extracted coal from the ground. Now it was turning raw materials into the structures of modern Australia. And then the world went to war. During the Second World War, the importance of Newcastle's steel industry became even clearer. Production was directed towards the demands of a nation fighting a global war. Steel went into ships, ammunition, guns, and the machinery of war. The workers were no longer simply producing steel for Newcastle. Their work had become part of Australia's national industrial capacity, but the war was only one chapter. In the decades that followed, the steelworks continued to expand. New furnaces, new rolling mills, new workshops, new technologies, and an increasingly sophisticated industrial workforce. By the late 1930s, Newcastle had become one of the great integrated steel-making centres of the British Empire. The transformation was extraordinary. A settlement whose early economy had depended on coal had become one of Australia's great industrial centres. And the story was no longer simply about furnaces. It was about engineering, metallurgy, research, technology. The steelworks was evolving with the country around it. For a time, there was little reason to believe that this world would ever disappear. But permanence can be deceptive. The system that had made Newcastle powerful had been built for a particular kind of world, a world where Australian industry was protected, where domestic demand was growing, and where local production had clear advantages. By the second half of the 20th century, that world was changing. Steel was becoming a global business, and Newcastle was about to discover how difficult it could be to compete in that new world. By the 1980s, Newcastle was still a steel city. The furnaces were still running. The ships were still arriving. Thousands of people still depended on the industry. But underneath that strength, something had changed. Across East Asia, steel makers were expanding. Technology was changing how steel could be produced. Production was becoming more efficient, and international competition was becoming harder to ignore. Newcastle faced another problem. An enormous integrated steelworks required constant investment to remain competitive. Much of its infrastructure had been designed for an earlier era, and the question was becoming increasingly difficult. How much should be spent to preserve an industrial system that was becoming harder to compete with? The steel industry went through major restructuring. Jobs were cut. Working practices changed. Newcastle survived, but survival was becoming more difficult. By the 1990s, the pressure was intensifying. Steel prices were falling. Global oversupply was putting pressure on producers, and Australian steelmakers were competing in an increasingly difficult international market. Newcastle still had coal. It still had a harbour. It still had skilled workers. But those advantages were no longer enough on their own, and the question was no longer just about Newcastle. It reached BHP itself. What kind of company did BHP want to become? The problem was no longer simply whether Newcastle could make steel. It was whether Newcastle could make steel economically enough to justify keeping the old system alive. In 1997, BHP announced that Newcastle's integrated steel-making operations would close. For a city that had spent generations building its identity around steel, the announcement was more than an industrial decision. It was a warning that the future people had assumed would always be there might not exist for the next generation. It would be easy to tell this as a story about a company abandoning a city, but the reality was more complicated. The global steel industry was under pressure, prices were falling, competition was intensifying, technology was changing, and BHP itself was restructuring its steel business. Newcastle was caught between two forces, a city that still understood the importance of steel, and a global company increasingly asking where its future capital should go. By September 1999, the end was no longer a possibility. It was a countdown. The decision had already been made. The workers knew it. The city knew it. And inside the steelworks, the machinery was still doing what it had done for generations. Heat, noise, fire, steel. The same process that had begun in Newcastle 84 years earlier was now approaching its final hours. For some workers, the end meant the loss of a job. For others, the end of a career. And for some families, the end of a tradition that had lasted across generations. There were workers who had spent decades inside the works. Some had followed their fathers through the same gates. Now, they were preparing to leave them for the last time. The steelworks had once been a place where people imagined their future. Now that future was coming to an end. In September 1999, the final stages of steelmaking were taking place. Former workers returned to see old friends, to remember, and to witness the end of an industry that had shaped their lives. Then the process came to an end. For 84 years, Newcastle had lived with the sound of steel. Now, there was silence. The machines stopped, the workers left, and by the end of September, the plant had closed. But the loss was never simply the steel. It was the certainty that came with it, the knowledge that there would always be another shift, another generation, another morning when the furnaces would be burning. That certainty was gone. But Newcastle was still there, and beneath the silence, another question was beginning. What do you do with a place after the industry that defined it is gone? Closing a steelworks does not mean the story is over. When the furnaces stopped, Newcastle was left with something much larger than an empty factory. It was left with the physical remains of 84 years of industry. Buildings had to be dismantled, machinery had to be removed, and the land itself had to be dealt with. For decades, steelmaking had left its mark beneath the surface. Industrial waste had accumulated. Soil and groundwater had been affected. The factory could disappear. The problem beneath it could not. Cleaning up the industrial site became another enormous undertaking. At the former steelworks, remediation required years of engineering and environmental work. One of the most striking measures was a barrier designed to prevent contaminated groundwater from moving towards the Hunter River. It reaches deep beneath the ground and stretches for more than a kilometre. A hidden piece of infrastructure protecting the river from the legacy of the industry that had once defined the city. The irony is difficult to miss. For generations, Newcastle's industrial landscape had been built around moving materials through the harbour. Now engineering was being used to prevent another legacy of that industry from reaching the water. The remediation took years, and as the land was cleaned and prepared for future use, another question emerged. What should happen to the ground where Newcastle had once made steel? Parts of the former industrial site found new industrial uses. Other areas were prepared for future development. The landscape was changing, but not everything from the old steelworks was lost. Some fragments were deliberately preserved. The former BHP administration precinct remains as a protected part of the industrial complex. Nearby, the former roll shop preserves another part of that industrial world. These are only fragments, but sometimes fragments are enough to tell you what once stood around them. And then, there are the people. At the former site, memorials remember the workers and the end of the steelworks. One memorial features cast bronze welding gloves. Gloves made to protect the hands of people who worked with steel, now preserved as a reminder of the work itself. The machines are gone, the hands remain in memory. Another memorial remembers workers who lost their lives in Newcastle's steel industry. It is a reminder that the history of the steelworks cannot be measured only in tons of steel. Behind every shift were people. Behind every worker was a family. And behind the success of the industry were risks that were sometimes paid for with lives. So what remains when an industry disappears? Not the furnaces, not the smoke, not the constant noise of machinery. What remains is more complicated. A building, a memorial, a photograph, a family story, a neighborhood, a skill passed from one generation to another, and land that still carries evidence of what happened there. Newcastle spent generations building an industrial city. Then, it spent years dismantling, cleaning, and reinventing parts of it. But perhaps the harder transformation was invisible. Newcastle had to learn how to imagine itself without the industry that had once told it what it was. When the steelworks closed, Newcastle did not suddenly become a different city. The harbour was still here, the railways were still here, the people were still here, and industry had not disappeared. What changed was the balance. For generations, Newcastle's economy had been dominated by heavy industry. After 1999, the city's economy became more diversified. Port operations, manufacturing, education, health, research, technology, services. The transition was not instant, and it was not painless. Thousands of people had spent their working lives in an economy built around large-scale industry. The city now had to create opportunities in a very different economic environment. But Newcastle had one advantage it had possessed long before BHP geography. The harbour remained a major industrial asset, the Hunter remained an enormous resource region, and Newcastle remained connected to the rest of Australia by rail, road and sea. The city did not abandon its industrial foundations. It began building a different economy around them. Alongside the port and remaining industrial activity, another Newcastle became more visible, a city increasingly associated with education, research, healthcare, services, culture, and the lifestyle that came with its coastline and harbour. The Newcastle that emerged was very different from the city of blast furnaces. But the transition came with a cost. Something was lost. Not only jobs, not only production, but a shared certainty. For generations, the answer to the question, what is Newcastle, had been remarkably simple. They worked in steel. Now, there was no single answer, but a more diversified economy also meant a city less dependent on one enormous employer. New careers could emerge. Younger generations were no longer tied to the same industrial path as their parents and grandparents. The future of Newcastle no longer had to look like its past, and yet, the past had not disappeared. Look closely, and the industrial city is still written into Newcastle. In the shape of the harbour, in the railway lines, in the old buildings, in the suburbs that grew around the works, and in the stories of families whose working lives began there. The modern city was not simply built after the industrial city disappeared. In many places, it was built on top of it, and that left Newcastle with a strange contradiction. The city had moved beyond steel, but it could never completely escape its relationship with it. The steel city remained in its buildings, its memorials, its families, and in the memory of people who had spent their lives inside the works. The steel had disappeared. The identity had not. Newcastle did not become a different city overnight. There was no single morning when the steel city disappeared and another Newcastle took its place. The transformation happened gradually. The economy changed, the waterfront changed, the former industrial land changed, and the city began building a future that looked very different from the one its grandparents had known. But the answer was never another single industry. Newcastle became more diverse, new industries emerged, new careers became possible, and younger generations were no longer tied to the same industrial path as their parents and grandparents. But reinvention did not erase the past. The old industrial city still survives in fragments, in heritage buildings, in memorials, in photographs, in family stories, and in the land itself. The Steel City may no longer exist in the form it once did, but its influence is still written across Newcastle. For generations, Newcastle had known what it was: a city of workers, a city of ships, a city of coal, a city of steel. Then that certainty disappeared, and perhaps that was the most profound change of all. Newcastle lost more than steel production in 1999. It lost the certainty that its future would look like its past, but that uncertainty also created the space for reinvention. And Newcastle's story is not unique. Across Australia, communities have been built around industries that once seemed permanent. Mining, manufacturing, railways, ports, steel, their landscapes change. Their industries disappear, but the people who built those places remain, and perhaps that is what Newcastle ultimately became. Not a city that forgot its industrial past, and not a city trapped by it, but a city that learned to carry that past forward while building something different. It could remember what it was, without allowing it to decide what it would become. For almost 3 decades, the idea of Newcastle as a steel city belonged to the past. The furnaces were gone, the workers had moved on, and much of the old industrial landscape had disappeared. But in 2026, steel was back in the conversation. Not the steel making of BHP, not the furnaces that once dominated Newcastle's skyline. Something different. Green Steel Australia has proposed building a new electric-powered steel plant on part of the former BHP steelworks site at Mayfield. The proposed facility would be far smaller than the industrial complex that once occupied the site, and the company says it could eventually produce hundreds of thousands of tons of finished steel each year. The proposed investment is around $500 million. If approved and developed as planned, the company is targeting operations from 2028. But the important part of this story is not simply that steel could return, it is how different the proposed model would be. The old Newcastle steelworks depended on an enormous integrated industrial system. Coal, coke, blast furnaces, massive infrastructure, thousands of workers. The proposed plant would use electric-powered steelmaking instead. Smaller, more technologically focused, built around a very different energy system. The company is also exploring technologies including green hydrogen as part of a longer-term ambition to produce lower-emission steel. But perhaps the more interesting question is not whether steel is being proposed again, but why here? The answer begins with the same geography that helped BHP choose Newcastle more than a century ago. A major port, rail connections, industrial land, a skilled workforce, and a city with generations of experience in steelmaking. The technology has changed. The economics have changed. The environmental expectations have changed. But some of Newcastle's original advantages remain. The same city, the same harbour, the same industrial geography, but not the same industry. If the proposal goes ahead, it would not recreate the old steel city. It would be an attempt to build something new on the foundations of the old one. And there is an important distinction. Newcastle's steel industry has not simply returned. This remains a proposal, so the question is not, has Newcastle become a steel city again? Not yet. The more interesting question is whether a city can take an industry that once defined it and reinvent that industry for a completely different world. Newcastle's story began with something buried beneath the ground. Coal gave the city its first industrial future, the harbour connected it to the world, and steel transformed it into something much larger. For 84 years, the furnaces helped define Newcastle. They gave generations of people work. They built communities. They shaped families, and they made the city part of Australia's industrial story. Then the furnaces went silent, but Newcastle did not. The city changed, it adapted, and it learned to build a future that no longer depended on the industry that had defined its past. But some things cannot be demolished. Memory, family history, the skills passed between generations, and the identity created by people who spent their lives making something here. Today, much of the old steelworks is gone, but the harbour remains, the land remains, the memories remain, and perhaps even the possibility of steelmaking remains. If the proposed new steel plant is eventually approved and built, it would not mean Newcastle was simply returning to the past. It would mean something more interesting, a city taking an industry that once defined it and asking whether it can have a place in the future. The furnaces went dark in 1999, but Newcastle never stopped changing. The Steel City is no longer the Newcastle you can see. It survives in the land, in the buildings, in the memories, and in the people who carried it forward. Because sometimes, when an industry disappears, It doesn't disappear from the place it built. Every place has a story. Some are easy to see, others remain beneath the surface. This is Beneath Australia. Until the next story.